Hello, and welcome to my YouTube channel, Reading Little Blue Books, out loud, and while stoned. In this video, we're going to start a new Little Blue Book. It is Little Blue Book number 51, and it is titled Giordano Bruno, His Life and Martyrdom, written by Coulson Turnbull. And this doesn't have the copyright year. It's copyrighted in the 1920s. And Giordano Bruno lived from 1548 to 1600. And let's see. Okay, here we go. Chapter 1. Early Days in Campania. Ordinary things and easy are for common and ordinary folk. Men rare, heroic, and divine pass along by means of this road of difficulty, until at last necessity herself is constrained to grant to them the palm of immortality. Giordano Bruno. Giordano Bruno, the philosopher, poet, and martyr, swept the intellectual heavens of Europe like a brilliant meteor in the latter half of the 16th century. He has been aptly named the wandering knight of a philosopher. In that most fertile country of the Campania, called sometimes the Fortunate, rests the city of Nola, a short distance from Naples and Mount Vesuvius. It is renowned for its resistance to Hannibal after the terrible slaughter of Cannae. Nola was also the birthplace of Octavius Caesar and Marcus Agrippa. It has furnished museums and cabinets with many archaic vases and coins showing its illustrious past. Today, it is but a small provincial city, but in ancient times, it was renowned for its culture and refinement. It was founded by the Chalcidian Greeks and was adorned in the emperor's time by turrets and walls and with palaces of the noble families of Rome. Its inhabitants were conspicuous for their courteous manners, their valor, keenness of perception, and love of study. It seems to have been a favorite place for the choice spirits of the Renaissance, and in spite of the fearful persecutions of pagan emperors and Christian princes, it still retained the grand philosophy of Pythagoras, nor were the sacred fires of the altar of Vesta ever suffered to die out. Poets, philosophers, artists, and other noted men were born here, or have at least taken up their abode here. They were, however, eclipsed by the fame of one man, equally remarkable for the fate of his life and for the grandeur of his mind and spirit, one who can really be ranked with that of Socrates in knowledge, and who also met a similar fate. Giordano Bruno had a great attachment to his home. He speaks of it as the golden fields of Nola. One of his youthful pleasures was to pass a night on the mountain Cicadia near his home, and watch the stars or contemplating with his childish mind the desolate sides of Vesuvius. From the distance, it looked barren and bleak, but when seen near, it was covered with elms and oaks, the branches of which were hung with grapevines. He recalls in later years how he used to think this was the limit of the horizon, or the ultimate end of the earth. It was then that Giordano Bruno learned, to his astonishment, that vision of man is deceptive. He saw that in going forward, we always remain in the center of our horizon, and soon the thought took root that nature is everywhere one and the same, that only distance changes the appearance of things. We saw how illusionary the senses might be, and how carefully the judgment must be held when only guided by the senses. The mind may grasp nature in her grandeur, but the sage must work out the details. Bruno seems to have been of a sad disposition and possessed of a lively imagination. His inner perception soon eclipsed his exterior reason. In his early years, the times were full of agitation and misfortune, and were scarcely propitious to study. Earthquakes, pestilence, and famine scourged fair Campania. The Turks fought and ravaged the country and carried off slaves. The land was also infested by bandits and outlaws. But worse, the Inquisition. With the bulls of Paul III, and at the instigation of Ignatius of Loyola, stood ready to light its fires and slaughter the heretic. Fateful constellations ruled the tragic nativity of Bruno. His father, Giovanna, was a soldier, and his mother, named Francisca Savallini, baptized her son under the name of Philip. At 15, he entered the monastery of the Dominicans at Naples. Whether this was from an early religious enthusiasm or to receive the protection of the convent, where he could study more devotedly, we cannot say. This same convent, having been the abode of Thomas Aquinas 300 years before, may have been a factor in his choice, for he tells he read with preference, at that time, the writings of Thomas Aquinas. It was in this convent he received the monastic name of Giordano. This name was that of one of the immediate followers of Saint Dominic, the general of the order, and his receiving the same name perhaps showed what hopes and wishes the order had in the capabilities of their new member. Here, for nearly 13 years he studied, gaining for himself a vast knowledge of ancient philosophy, which is shown in his works. He evidently was a deep student of Plotinus, Pythagoras, the Orphic wisdom of Greece as well. It was in this convent that this powerful soul reached independence of thought, under the pressure of his automatic routine and deadening environments. He seems early to have troubled his censor while a monk. He practiced austere studies, and his mind was held in fervor of mystical thought, so that his censor tried to divert him away from his higher occupations, and even fetter his mind, trying to change the free man in the service of virtue to the slave of bewildering hypocrisy. Bruno did not fail to notice the weaknesses and peculiarities of his brothers in the order. His sharp eye and cutting tongue spared not their delinquencies, and soon turned his back on his companions, who in turn grew suspicious of him. He tried to escape the childish exercises of the monks and their adoration for relics. Even during his novitiate, he was threatened with an accusation in matters of belief. He had removed the pictures of the saints from his cell, and only retained the crucifix. When one of his brothers read a poem called The Seven Joys of Mary, he asked him to read something more sensible and rational. For this, he only received a threat. In his 18th year, he mentions he began to doubt the church doctrine of the Trinity. He looked upon the persons as attributes of the deity, and referred to Augustinus, who considered the person as a new thing and only used it with great caution. One may easily see him, even at this early date, the iconoclast and spiritual crusader. The impulse to doubt is often a great blessing to the world. Bruno's spiritual development received a decisive, impetuous nay. Even the destiny of his whole life was changed on his first acquaintance with the works of Copernicus. Copernicus' words knocked early at the portals of the youth's soul, but after 20 years the impression of it had still remained very vivid. Suddenly, he seemed to see himself freed from fetters. The truth which he now believed to see, yes, even to be able to grasp with his hands, seemed to have been until now imprisoned in the fastidious spheres of heaven. How much he admired the large soul of that German who, unconcerned about the foolishness of the crowd, had remained steadfast toward the mighty tide of an opposite belief. He looked upon this new teaching as something related to his spirit, as an innate truth. He could, he found, use it freely and enlarged upon it. With bolder confidence, he removed the last bond which even Copernicus had left standing. His spirit took flight into the infinite of the universe. And how brightly shone the beautiful world to him now! What a wonderful possession this new doctrine! With what imagination and inspiration did his whole being respond to it! The feeble, medieval, churchly world passed from his mental vision like a baneful phantasmagoria. But this new cosmology, this world order, demanded a reconstruction of thought, a new metaphysic, nay, a new theology, and in order to make them known, he recognized this to be his life's mission, his true vocation. With what energy he devoted himself to his mission, that one who has discovered his genius can only tell. From neo-phantomism and deeper writings of Nicholas von Kues, he took principally the elements of his philosophy. He recognized in this gifted author an especial affinity, who was only held back from freer movement by his priestly garb. The spirit of inner inspiration was much needed in that day. But to the muse of the cloister life, he not only devoted his deep philosophical studies and outlines, but also he added the cheerful occupation of writing earnest poetry. The comedy Il Candelero, and certainly also many of his sacred songs, which he later used in the dialogues of Gil Iraci Führer, the heretic enthusiast, had their origin at this time. His fine work, this fine work of Bruno, has been excellently translated into English by L. Williams, in which the translator says it is an ethical poem portraying the struggles of the soul in its upward progress toward purification and freedom. And the author, Bruno, makes use of lower things to picture and suggest the higher. The aim of the heretic enthusiast, heroic enthusiast, heretic enthusiast. The heroic enthusiast is to get at the truth and see the light. And he considers that all the trials and sufferings of this life are the cords which draw the soul upwards, and the spur which quickens the mind and purifies the will. The blindness of the soul may signify the descent into the material body, and visiting the various kingdoms may be an allusion to the soul passing through the mineral, vegetable, and animal kingdoms before it arrives at man. A satirical poem, The Ark of Noah, dedicated to the Pope, appeared in 1570, which now, however, is not to be found anywhere. We are acquainted only with its subject through a later dialogue. In it we find the donkey quarrels for precedence among the animals, which to lose is great danger, referring to the Pope and the worldly powers. In his 24th year, Bruno, after consecration, read his first Mass in the city of Campania and remained there for some time in the cloister of St. Bartholomew and other cloisters of the province, performing his priestly functions, reading Masses, and delivering sermons. After 3 years, he returned to the monastery at Naples, evidently disgusted with the conditions he had encountered, for in his work, Il Candeleo, he pictures the fearful demoralization which surrounded him. Make sure I have the right page. It surrounded him. Yep. And arraigned in strong satire the principal groups of stupidity, rascality, and hypocrisy, rascality. Being of a frank and open character, he was unable to hide his estrangement to the church's doctrines. He put his convictions before some of his companions, and with great zeal they hastened to lay them before their superiors. It seems he had contrasted and evidently praised the methods of the Unitarians in expounding their theological doctrines, who referred all things to the Father. This and other heretical propositions were brought to the notice of the Holy Office, who quietly observed him, and next threatened him. Warned of his danger, he secretly left Naples and took the road to Rome, where he was received into the cloister della Minerva. Here, a sudden, though not unexpected turn of events followed. The provincial of the order, Fray Domenico Vito, raised against him, in 130 articles, the accusation of heresy. Instructions also for his arrest had been forwarded from Naples. Through letters from friends, Bruno had learned that some of his concealed and forbidden books left in Naples had been found, namely the writings from Chrysostom and Hieronymus. I don't think I'm pronouncing that first one right. But with some notes of Erasmus attached. To have possessed such works could only make matters much worse. So he quickly and resolutely laid aside the habit of his order and wandered destitute and forlorn from the Roman Campania. His very sorry condition being a safeguard against the robbers and bandits who infested the land. This was in 1576, or the 28th year of his age. He broke his monastic vows to pledge himself anew to truth and reason. And now commenced the wanderings of Bruno, lasting over 15 years, and which led him over half of Europe. He tried everywhere to make known his new teachings concerning the universe, a passionate restlessness which, within him, never permitted him to find a permanent place for his work. Reversals and the secret doings of his enemies followed him. His life was a constant struggle with the guild of scientists. Wherever he went, he made enemies, partly through his satirical address and possible hastiness. His zeal carried him along, and was a marked contrast to the indifference of his opponents in the presentation of their science and philosophy. He said that other philosophers had not found out so much, therefore they had not so much to guard and defend as he had. They may, of course, think less of a philosophy which was good for nothing, or of one which they had nothing of. But he, who has found a hidden truth and is charmed by its beauty, is jealous that it shall not be counterfeited, or neglected, or desecrated. In the midst of this ruthlessness, he created his philosophical masterpieces, the Italian dialogues, in which his spirit is expressed so freely and richly. The Latin writings are full of poetic verse and mythical depth. Beside these, he wrote a number of treatises on the Lulic art, which was founded by Raymondus Lullus, a Spanish scholar of the 13th century. With the diligence peculiar to genius, he multiplied his powers in many ways. Returning to Bruno's flight, we find him on a Genoese vessel bound for the Ligurian port, hoping to find a refuge from his persecutors. But Genoa was in a state of civil war, and also devastated by pestilence. Once more, on the road to exile, we find him at Nole on the Riviera. God, you'd swear I hadn't read this already. A pretty little town nestling at the foot of high hills, crowned with feudal castles and towers. Here he instructed boys in grammar to get sustenance, but this modest employment did not satisfy him, for he delivered some gentlemen of standing lectures in astronomy or the science of the sphere. He expounded the system of Copernicus, and with great enthusiasm spoke of the polarity of worlds and the movement of the earth. From Liguria, like Columbus, Bruno was banished. In the humble schoolmaster teaching grammar, there was nothing to fear, but the nobles, bishops, and clergy who attended his lectures suspected heresy. And in a few months Bruno moved on to Turin, where men of letters and philosophy were attracted by the generosity of Duke Emanuele Filberto, a warrior, artist, and scholar, and a man of strong character. But the Duke had fallen into the hands of the Jesuits, and Bruno, who had hoped to teach in the university, found the place occupied by his enemies. L. Williams, in his introduction, The Heroic Enthusiast, tells us that Tasso, the Italian poet, had also sought refuge in Turin, driven by adverse fortune. Both so great, both subject to every species of misfortune and persecution in life, and destined to immortal honors after their death. The light of genius burned in them both. The fire of enthusiasm flamed in each alike, and on the forehead of each was set the sign of sorrow and of pain. Both Bruno and Tasso entered the cloister as boys. The one joined the Dominicans, the other the Jesuits, and in the souls of both might be discerned the impress of the order to which they belonged. Both went forth from their native place longing to find a broader field of action and greater scope for their intellectual powers. One left Naples carrying in his heart the pagan and Christian traditions of the noble, enterprises in the saintly heroism of Olympus and of Calvary, of Homer and the fathers of Plato and Saint Ignatius. The other was filled with the philosophical thought of the primitive Italian and Pythagorean epochs, fecundated by his own conceptions and by the new age. Philosopher and apostle of an idea, Bruno consecrated his life to the development of it in his writings and to the propagation of his principles in Europe by the fire of enthusiasm. The one surprised the world with the melody of his song, lulled the anguish of lacerated Italy, and gilded the chains which bound her. The other tried to shake her, to recall to life with the vigor of thought, with the force of reason, with the sacrifice of himself. The songs of Tasso were heard and sung from one end of Italy to the other, and the poet dwelt in palaces and received the caress and smile of princes, while Bruno, discoursing in the name of reason and science, was rejected, persecuted, and scourged, and only after 3 centuries of ingratitude, of calumny, and of forgetfulness does his country show signs of appreciating him and of doing justice to his memory. In Tasso, the poet predominates over the philosopher. In Bruno, the philosopher predominates over and eclipses the poet. The first sacrifices thought to form. The second is careful only of the idea. Again, both are full of conception of the divine, but the God that the dying Tasso confessed is a God that is expected and comes not, while the God that Bruno proclaims he already finds within himself. Tasso dies in his bed in the cloister, uneasy, as on a bed of thorns. Bruno, amidst the flames, stands out as on a pedestal, and dies serene and calm. Our wanderer reached Venice at a time of great confusion and terror. The plagues which had devastated the entire Upper Italy, with the exception of Turin, had reached this city. Half of its inhabitants had died. The aged Tilton, almost a centenarian, succumbed to its deadly harvest. Venice was at that time the bookmart of Europe, and Bruno, fearless of the conditions prevalent, decided to remain and prepare for the press, the signs of the times, hoping thereby to gain a little money for his few wants. This work, like all his writings published in Italy, were destroyed. Next, we find Bruno in Padua. But as the university and printing houses were closed on account of the plague, he did not tarry long. Lodging with a few brothers of his order, he says, they persuaded me to wear the dress, Dominican again, even though I would not profess the religion it implied, because they said it would aid in my wayfaring to be thus attired. And so I got a white cloth robe, and I put on the hood, which I had preserved when I left Rome. After 3 years of wandering, he finally decided to leave his native land. He hated dissimulation. Alterio petto was Bruno's motto, and dressed as monk, schoolmaster, mechanic, he had found no resting place, nowhere to call home, none to understand him, all ready to denounce him. He viewed with sorrow the upper classes, who were corrupt, illiterate, and uncultivated. His country was overrun with Spaniards, and everywhere was the petty tyrant. That is the end of chapter 1 of of Little Blue Book number 51, Giordano Bruno, His Life and Martyrdom, written by Coulson Turnbull. Thanks for listening, and join me in part 2.